An air raid siren is blaring from my town's World War II bunker, but there isn't a siren down there. What are we hearing? The town's only air raid siren was decommissioned after decades of disuse in the late 90s. For that matter, the siren had always been mounted on a steel pole out in an open field, so as to be heard by all residents in the area. There was never a siren within the abandoned air raid shelter at the edge of town, but an unmistakable wartime wail has been thundering through our streets for the past hour. It's midnight now, and I still hear the drone of that motorized cylinder. It yowls and warbles, sliding in a glissando from high to low to high to low again. We all know what we're hearing, even those of us born decades after the end of the war. We know that nightmarish sound from grainy footage and documentaries. Hearing it in the flesh is more haunting than words can explain. A councilman named Martin posted on the town's Facebook page to say that he'd traced the racket to the old air raid shelter at the edge of town, a bunker abandoned midway through the war and left standing as a memorial of sorts to the soldiers of that era. Anyhow, some townsfolk have agreed to join Martin in investigating the sound and hopefully putting a stop to it. I'll be joining them in a mo, but I wanted to post about this before leaving the house, as I'm hoping that a Redditor might have an explanation. Most folk are calling it an awfully insensitive practical joke, saying that we'll get down there to find a cluster of portable speakers, perhaps looping a recording of the infamous air raid siren. My gut says something else. Truth be told, I don't much fancy joining Martin's search party, considering what they say happened down there in the 40s. Update 1, just been on our first trip down there, and we found nothing yet other than a spook that sent one of the lads packing, so I've accompanied him back to the surface, and I thought I'd edit my post a little to offer an update. When we all gathered in that overgrown field at the town's outskirts, with torches lighting the rusted, weed-coated bunker door ahead, that was when the dread truly set into my bones. They were standing ajar. I ought to get home, I fibbed, scratching my nape uncomfortably. That did nothing to lower the hairs on the back of my neck. Mary was struggling with the dogs as I left. They won't stop howling. You know what else won't stop howling, Lenny? Asked Martin. Then he jammed a finger at the browning metal entrance ahead, mostly reclaimed by nature. That infernal siren. We need to find it and shut it up. I don't like this, Mrs. Lutherton said, shuffling anxiously from toe to toe. My father closed up the shelter in the 50s. Who opened it? Same kids playing this prank, huffed Mr. Lutherton. Are we doing this, Martin? The councilman nodded and motioned for us to follow. As we followed the middle-aged man to the bunker entrance, Harry, the youngest of the bunch, placed a hand on Mrs. Lutherton's shoulder. I'm happy to wait with you by the cars if you don't want to go inside. Mr. Lutherton rolled his eyes and grumbled, but Mrs. Lutherton smiled. That's awfully kind of you, Harry, but I'm fine. I'm not that old and decrepit just yet. No, I didn't think you were, answered Harry. I just thought you might be scared, I finished inwardly. You thought she might be scared, just like the rest of us. As we sidled through the bunker door, each of us seeming hesitant to edge closer to whoever might be down there, the blare of the siren loudened. I suppose it had to be deafening to carry so effectively out of such a slim opening into the town at large. Steps of galvanized steel led down into a brickwork dungeon of sorts. Formerly, red bricks turned mostly gray. They were coated with damp and mold and things that wriggled, perhaps retreated from the light, having become accustomed to the dark after generations in that mass graveyard. Apparently, hundreds of townsfolk perished down there. The bodies were cleaned up by the scraps of surviving residents, then the bunker was, following the end of the war, sealed away. In the field, there's a plaque commemorating the lost souls by name. Anyhow, we followed a long tunnel, 15 meters in breadth and untold meters in depth, past a neat, endless row of bunk beds. Then Harry got spooked, said he saw a shadow move past one of the beds. I didn't hear anything, but I agreed to take the poor lad back to the surface. He said he's going to wait for us just outside the entrance so as to catch those kids if they resurface. I'm going back down to help the others. I'll provide another update once I come up. Update 2, Jesus. If anybody has figured out the location of this air raid shelter, do not share it and do not come here. I went back down, phone torch leading the way. I was hoping to catch up to Martin and the Luthertons, but the trio seemed to have gone quite far ahead. I called for them, but my yells were swallowed by the bray of that blasted, deafening siren. After walking perhaps 100 meters or so, I made it to the end of the tunnel, a bunking area large enough to sleep every single wartime resident of my modestly sized town, I would imagine. An archway opened onto a perpendicular passage, so I entered it, turned left, then took a second left into a tunnel parallel to the first, which served as the dining hall. As I shouted names into the room of grubby, decaying, picnic-style benches, there came a deafening cry of pain, loud enough to penetrate the wall of sound built by the eternal air raid siren. It came from the counter at the far side of the room, another 100 meters away, so I stopped yelling and ran towards it. And as I neared the counter, a frail hand reached up from the other side, a hand stained with blood. Then came that sharp, paralyzing fear which near immobilizes the body. What the fuck was I seeing? I didn't wait for an answer. I lifted myself over the former serving counter, dropped to the other side, and spun to look at the shelving underneath. I don't know whether I screamed or fell flat on my rear first. It was Mr. and Mrs. Lutherton. 2 sardines of flesh and bone were crammed under there, faces fully gouged out, brains and bones, and all as if their faces had been scooped out and rendered bloody, skeletal bowls. Most impossibly of all, Mr. Lutherton's hand was still moving. That old man, who should have been dead, was raising his arm and outstretching those fingers pleadingly, as if hoping someone could untangle him and his wife from their mashed, contorted heap beneath the counter. Nobody could save them. They were dead. Had to be dead. I slid away in fear, legs jellied and useless whilst I screamed and wiped away the snot and tears from my face. I don't know how long it took my flight response to kick into action, but I eventually stumbled to my feet, jumped back over the counter, and dashed back through the deserted cafeteria. As I ran back the way I came, the siren grew louder, but I ignored that. I scurried through the passageway, then into the first tunnel. The row of beds stood beside me, and the bunker entrance stood in the distance, up a small staircase. My hope of escape, but I wasn't alone in that tunnel. There was Martin, the last surviving member of the search party, standing 50 or so meters ahead of me. It took me a second to realize that he was an obstacle. That realization hit a moment after the dread, the nightmarish feeling in my gut that the man ahead wasn't the man who'd come down with me. "Martin?" I meekly asked. And the man did not turn slowly. He snapped his body around in response to my voice. When he did, I screamed again. The councilman's skull had been gouged, much like the skulls of the Luthertons, to leave little more than the back and sides of his head. Flaps of skin surrounded that crater within his face and whirred in a breeze. A stream of air generated by the air raid siren, which was, I realized, coming deep from within the man's body. Martin's hands clawed at his face, as if trying to find something, and when he found only a hole spewing out that wartime wail, he started to dart forwardly, feet zigzagging haphazardly. He was barreling towards me. I clasped my lips to prevent another scream, another sound that might draw that terrifying thing towards me, even if he were still Martin, a somewhat human man in a state of panic. I squeezed between 2 bunk beds, murmuring fearfully as the stumbling, faceless man closed the gap between us. Then I slipped into a narrow gap between the bunk beds and the wall, only 2 meters wide, but it seemed odd to not have the beds pressed up against the wall. There, hiding in the dark, I heard something else, something breathing in the blackness. A breath so small, so close, and so intimate, so loud, though it was only a whisper, it managed to be heard atop the roar of Martin's air raid siren. Only it wasn't a human breath. It felt, to me, like the low hum of air from something mechanical. More of a klaxon than an air raid siren, yet somehow far more alive. More alive than even Martin, breathing his siren through fleshy filters. I flashed my light to my right, towards the sound of the breathy klaxon, and it stopped. Stopped as the torch glow met the forgotten rags of some corpse. A man forgotten at the bottom of that bunker, which seemed surprising given the significance of his garbs. A black domed helmet of dented steel, plastered with a large, white W, this was the air raid warden. Another impossibility to my eyes was that the man's skeletal remains hadn't decomposed, hadn't turned to ash, and that revealed the ghastliness of his death. His skull had been, much like the skulls of Martin and the Luthertons, caved inwards. Then wind whistled up through what would have once been the esophagus, spilling out of the cavity, to produce the faint, resurrecting breeze of that klaxon sound I had heard. I didn't want to give it a chance. Powered onwards purely by adrenaline, as my mind hadn't the time to collapse into pure, existential dread, I scooped up the bones and warden attire, coughing at the ash and dust, but pushing onwards. I decided that, perhaps, giving the man a proper burial would bring an end to that supernatural hell. My mother was a Christian, and she believed in restless spirits, believed that all people deserved to rest once their time had come. After the night I've had, I don't know what I believe. I followed the hidden passage, behind the heads of the bunk beds, towards the beginning of the tunnel. Then I scooted out and tiptoed up the staircase, skeletal remains in my clutches. The door's already narrow opening had slimmed down. I wasn't going to fit through it. Panic resurfacing, I heard Harry saying that a gust had swung the door closed. Torch still in my hand, poking out between the air raid warden's corpse, I could see the glint of the handyman working hard to pry the door apart from the wall. "Are you going to help?" he grunted, managing only to inch the door very slowly open. "Or do you want to stay stuck in there?" I looked down at the corpse in my hands, trying to think of a response, when the air raid sirens suddenly cut out. I could hear only a persistent ringing in my ears, some muffled words from Harry, then the dull thuds of boots against the floor of the shelter below. I turned to see Martin. That faceless horror extended its arms extending outwards, and I begged the councilman, through blubbers, to recognize me, to not hurt me. And then I saw it for myself. Saw whatever Harry saw. A shadowy mass, black save for the flicker of colors and shapes, the outline of a white W, much like the one on the warden's helmet below me. The black mass swooped across the way and looped its near-formless shape under Martin's arms, before yanking him away, down the tunnel and far from me. The air raid siren started again, and I knew in that moment that it was the sound of the councilman screaming. I was pulled out of that trance by the sound of Harry yelling, metal groaning, and the outside wind wailing. I twisted to see that the bunker door stood wide open, and Harry lay on the grass, staring at me and the corpse and the inexplicably open door in bewilderment. I took my opportunity to flee, carrying the body with me, and then the two of us gasped as the skeleton turned to ash the moment I crossed the threshold, leaving me carrying only an old, dusty, air raid warden's uniform in my arm. Then the bunker door slammed shut behind us, and the siren, the cry of Martin, died behind it. I left the uniform in that field, Harry and I drove home, and I've been standing in my bedroom for hours, typing and retyping this update. Looking out at that field, 2 streets over, the bunker that lurks in the dark, watching and waiting as it has done for 80 years. What lives down there?